The bank teller's face, a carefully neutral mask moments before, flickered with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pity? Confusion? She looked from her monitor to me, then back again. Mr. Bennett, I'm showing a zero balance. The words hung in the sterile, air-conditioned space. My chest constricted, a sudden, sharp pain that made me grab the edge of the marble counter. 43 years I'd spent as a train conductor, the rhythmic clatter of the rails the soundtrack to my life. Every single paycheck, a portion was dutifully set aside, a promise I'd made to my wife, Catherine, that our final years would be comfortable. Our future, quantified and cataloged, amounted to $287,000. Now it was gone. That's impossible, I rasped, my voice sounding distant. Please, check again. She tapped at her keyboard, her expression unchanging. Same result. A tremor started in my hands as I fumbled for my phone to call Dean, my son. The phone rang 4 times, each tone a hammer blow against my hope, before rolling to his cheerful, recorded voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. The teller offered me a plastic cup of water, but I couldn't move. My life's work, every holiday shift, every lonely night away from my family, had vanished into thin air. I drove home on autopilot, the familiar streets of my neighborhood looking alien and menacing. My mind cycled through a frantic list of explanations: a catastrophic bank error, a sophisticated identity theft, a simple computer glitch. Anything but the cold, heavy truth that was already settling in my gut. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, I called Walter Burns. He'd been my lawyer for 2 decades, a man I trusted implicitly, the same man who had patiently guided me through the legal maze of my wife's estate after she passed. His secretary, recognizing my name, put me through without delay. "Arthur, good to hear from you," he said, his voice a familiar, reassuring baritone. I stumbled through the explanation, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. The bank, the zero balance, the unanswered calls to Dean. The silence that followed on his end of the line was long and unnerving. Finally, a heavy sigh. "Arthur, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he began, his tone shifting from friendly to clinical. "Family disputes of this nature rarely end well in a courtroom. The legal fees alone would decimate whatever you might recover. My professional advice: let this go. Dean's your only son. Some things, Arthur, matter more than money." My throat felt like it was closing up. "Walter, that money is my life. My heart medication alone costs $400 a month." Another pause, this one calculated. "I understand your frustration, I truly do, but you need to think about the bigger picture. Think about Thanksgiving, Christmas. Is this really worth losing your family over?" I hung up the phone without another word, staring at the receiver in my hand as if it were a venomous snake that had just bitten me. Sleep offered no escape that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the teller's pitying face and the impossible zero on the screen. At 4 in the morning, fueled by a mixture of black coffee and desperation, I drove to the state pension office. The building was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows across the empty hallways. A young clerk with kind eyes listened to my story and, without question, began printing every document associated with my account. Back home, I spread the mountain of paperwork across my kitchen table as the sun rose, the pale light illuminating the stark black and white text. And there it was, on page 7 of a transfer request authorization, a beneficiary change form, dated just 6 months ago. My signature sat at the bottom, neat and perfectly formed. Except it wasn't mine. I snatched my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and studied it, my heart hammering against my ribs. The signature was flawless, a perfect replica of my handwriting from 10 years ago. But my real signature, the one I used now, carried the slight, telltale tremor of arthritis in my right hand. This one was smooth, fluid, confident, the signature of a younger man. Someone had practiced this. They had traced my old signatures from checks and letters until they could forge a copy so perfect it would fool anyone. I thought of Dean's handwriting, how people always remarked on how similar it was to my own. A cold dread, heavier than any I had ever known, settled deep within me. My car seemed to drive itself to Maple Street, to the small blue house where my son lived. I hadn't been there in 3 months, not since he had started canceling our usual Sunday dinners with a string of flimsy excuses. His wife, Natalie answered the door, her smile failing to reach her eyes. Arthur, this isn't a good time, she said, her body language defensive as she blocked the entryway. Through the gap in the doorway, my eyes took in their living room. New, plush leather furniture replaced the worn-out sofa I'd helped them move in. A television the size of a small car dominated the far wall. And parked in their driveway, I'd noticed on my way in, was a gleaming silver BMW with temporary license plates still in the window. Dean's job at the hardware store earned him $30,000 a year. Natalie worked part-time as a substitute teacher. The math was impossible. It didn't add up. I need to speak with Dean, I said, my voice quiet but firm. He's not home, she replied too quickly. But then I heard it. A subtle movement from the second floor, the sound of footsteps trying and failing to be silent. Natalie saw the recognition in my eyes, and her face hardened. She began to push the door closed. I'll be sure to tell him you stopped by. The door clicked shut with a definitive finality before I could utter another word. Just before the lock engaged, in that final, fleeting second, my gaze fell upon the mantelpiece above their fireplace. Something golden caught the afternoon light, a familiar, heartbreaking glint. It was my wife Catherine's gold watch. The one her father had given her for her 21st birthday in 1960. The one she wore every single day until the cancer finally took her 5 years ago. In her will, she had left it to me, with a handwritten note asking me to keep it safe. I treasured it, keeping it tucked away in my top dresser drawer, carefully wrapped in the soft linen handkerchief she had embroidered with our initials, A and C, intertwined. He must have taken it during one of his last visits, perhaps when I was in the bathroom or in the kitchen making us coffee. My vision blurred with sudden, hot tears. The money was one thing, a betrayal of trust. But this was a desecration of memory. I turned and walked back to my car on legs that felt like they might buckle beneath me. I sat in the driver's seat for what felt like an eternity, unable to summon the strength to turn the key. My son had not only stolen my future, he had stolen my past. And he'd done it all while smiling at me over Sunday dinners, calling me dad, and pretending that everything was perfectly fine. The official letter arrived on a Thursday, its crisp envelope feeling heavy with malice in my hand. I slid it open with a trembling finger. The language was cold, bureaucratic. Transfer request for the full balance of pension account #74-228. B has been approved and processed by the designated beneficiary, Mr. Dean Bennett. It listed the exact date of the withdrawal, the routing numbers, and the receiving account information. Everything was presented as if it were the most routine transaction in the world. At the bottom of the page were 2 signatures. The first was Dean's, scrawled with an arrogance I could now see clearly. The second signature, listed under the title of legal witness, made my hands go numb. It was Walter Burns, my lawyer, my trusted friend. He had witnessed the transfer. He had known about this for 6 long months and had said nothing. When I had called him in a panic, he had feigned surprise, counseling me to let it go for the sake of family. They had worked together. My own lawyer and my own son, partners in the complete destruction of my life. I sat at my kitchen table, the damning letter lying between my shaking hands, and understood for the very first time that I had been utterly and completely alone for half a year, while the 2 people I trusted most in the world conspired to rob me of everything. The betrayal was an invisible poison, suffocating me in a room full of air. I still kept my old work notebook, a small, dog-eared spiral pad where I'd meticulously tracked every penny I'd earned and saved since 1982. Catherine used to laugh at my careful, almost obsessive record-keeping, affectionately calling me her personal accountant. I found it in a dusty box in the basement, still wrapped in the protective plastic I'd put it in upon my retirement. Inside, preserved like historical artifacts, were 40 years of deposit receipts, pension statements, and matching identification codes. I knew the state pension system used a specific internal coding format for authorizations, a complex alphanumeric sequence that was updated every decade for security. Spreading my old statements across the dining room table, I compared them to the codes on the withdrawal authorization letter. My heart gave a sudden leap. They didn't match. The authorization code used on the forged document corresponded to the 1990 to 2000 system protocol, not the current one. It was a small, technical discrepancy, an obscure detail that a hurried forger, even one as careful as Dean, wouldn't know to check. It was proof. Tangible proof of fraud. I spent the next 3 hours at the public library, carefully photocopying every relevant page and organizing them into a neat folder. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. As I drove home, I didn't notice the dark sedan that pulled out from the curb behind me, following me at a discreet distance before parking 3 houses down from mine. The knock on my door came at 11:47 p.m. It wasn't a polite tap. It was 3 heavy, demanding pounds that echoed through the silent house and made me jump from my armchair. I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the peephole, I saw the familiar silhouette of my son standing on the porch, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. I opened the door slowly, just a crack. "Dean." He didn't offer a smile or a greeting. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Can I come in?" Reluctantly, I stepped aside. He strode past me into the living room, but remained standing, pacing in front of the fireplace like a caged animal. "You've been asking questions," he began, his back to me. "Going to the pension office, making copies of old documents." "People talk, Dad." I remained silent, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of condescension and warning. "Dad, you're 74 years old. You're getting confused. This whole situation is just a simple misunderstanding that's gotten completely out of hand." His tone was gentle, infuriatingly so, the kind of placating voice one might use with a difficult child or a senile old man. "Let's just drop this before you embarrass yourself further." I smelled the faint, sour scent of whiskey on his breath, and beneath it, something else I recognized instantly. It was the sharp, undeniable stench of fear. Dean took a step closer, his forced gentleness evaporating as he lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "If you push this, Dad, it's going to get messy for you. Very messy. People will find out you couldn't manage your own finances. They'll start talking, saying you were incompetent, that you needed someone to step in and help. Is that how you want people remembering you? As the old conductor who lost his mind?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for a trace of the boy I had raised, the child I taught to ride a bike, the young man I proudly walked down the aisle at his wedding. All I saw now were cold, calculating eyes. He had become a stranger. "You already took my dignity when you forged my signature on that document," I said, my voice barely a whisper but steady and clear. "You already took my wife's memory when you stole her watch. There's nothing left for you to threaten me with." A muscle twitched in his jaw. His mask of concern crumbled, revealing the raw anger beneath. He turned on his heel and walked out without another word. Through the front window, I watched his car back aggressively out of my driveway. As his taillights swept across my front hedge in a brief, red arc, something glinted in the darkness just beyond my property line. It was the distinct, unmistakable reflection of glass. A camera lens. Someone had been photographing my house. The business card was slipped under my front door sometime before dawn. I found it on the mat when I went to retrieve the morning paper. It was plain white cardstock, with simple, centered black text. Ellen Price, investigative journalist, followed by a phone number. There was no newspaper affiliation, no email address, no credentials. My first instinct was to throw it away, to dismiss it as some kind of strange prank. But something stayed my hand. I thought about the camera lens in the hedge, about Dean's veiled threats. I was being watched. I was in over my head. With a trembling hand, I dialed the number. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Mr. Bennett, I'm glad you decided to call," she said, before I'd even spoken my name. "I've been documenting systemic pension fraud in Ohio for the past 8 months. Your case, Mr. Bennett, fits a very specific pattern I've been tracking." My heart began to race. How did you know about my case?" I stammered. "Your lawyer's name, Walter Burns, has appeared in 3 other highly suspicious investigations involving elderly clients. When my source at the pension office told me you'd been in requesting old files, I knew you were the connection I needed." She suggested we meet for coffee. I hesitated, Dean's warning echoing in my ears. Then I pictured Catherine's watch on his mantle. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. The diner on 4th Street. Come alone." Ellen Price arrived precisely at 10, carrying a worn leather folder so thick it could have been a phone book. She was younger than I'd pictured, perhaps 40, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She slid into the booth opposite me and, after a brief greeting, spread a series of documents across the table. They were a dizzying collection of bank statements, international wire transfers, and shell company registrations. Walter Burns's signature was a recurring motif, appearing on 17 different accounts. He uses family members of his victims as proxies, Ellen explained, her voice low and direct. They are named as beneficiaries, allowing them to access the pension funds and withdraw them legally. Then, they transfer the money through a labyrinth of accounts before it ultimately lands in Burns's offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. The families, for their part in the betrayal, get a cut, usually 20%. She pushed a highlighted bank statement across the table toward me. My eyes found the name, Dean Bennett. The page showed a single deposit of $57,000, made 3 days after my entire pension was withdrawn. The air left my lungs. My son had sold me out, had sold our entire history, for $57,000. Ellen leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. I can expose this entire network, Arthur. But I need irrefutable evidence. Recordings, documents they don't know you have. Something that ties them all together. We met again 2 days later, our conversation held in the relative anonymity of her car in a crowded grocery store parking lot. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dashboard. Ellen handed me a small, sleek device that looked exactly like an expensive fountain pen. It's a high-fidelity voice recorder, she explained. Clip it to the inside of your shirt pocket. The microphone is right here. She pointed to a tiny hole near the top. Just press the top of the pen once to start recording. Press it again to stop. My hands trembled as I took it from her. The cool metal felt unnaturally heavy. I was a train conductor, a man who had lived his life by timetables and rules. I was not a spy. Arthur, I know this feels wrong, Ellen said gently, sensing my hesitation. But you have to remember, they are the ones who committed the crime. They committed fraud. They stole from you, and from dozens of others. This isn't about revenge, it's about evening the odds. I thought about my empty bank account, about the prescription bottles on my counter that I could barely afford to refill. I thought of the condescending look on Dean's face when he'd called me confused. I clipped the pen into my pocket. What do I need to do? Get one of them talking, she said. Dean or Burns. Call them. Let them think you're giving up, that you're scared. People love to explain how they outsmarted someone. That evening, I picked up the phone. Son, I said, my voice carefully modulated. I'd like to talk. Can we meet? We agreed to meet at Riverside Park the following afternoon. The sky was a uniform, gloomy gray, matching my mood. Dean arrived 15 minutes late, wearing expensive sunglasses despite the complete absence of sun. He sat on the bench beside me but kept a careful distance, refusing to look at me directly. What is it, Dad? He asked, his tone impatient. The recorder was running, a silent witness in my shirt pocket. I let out a long, weary sigh, making my voice sound tired and defeated. I talked to Walter again, I began. He helped me understand that I was confused about the whole pension situation, that my memory isn't what it used to be. I just want to move forward now. I watched as the tension visibly drained from Dean's shoulders. He finally turned to look at me. That's good, Dad. That's a smart decision. I decided to push a little further, to see if he would take the bait. I just don't understand how the transfer happened so quickly. Walter mentioned something about the paperwork being expedited. Dean shifted uncomfortably on the bench. Yeah, well, there's a guy, Carlton, who handles the processing at the state office. Walter knows him. He made sure everything went through smoothly, without any delays or red flags. My heart jumped. Ellen had mentioned a high-level accountant they suspected but couldn't pin down. Dean continued, a note of warning in his voice. You really don't want to dig into this any deeper, Dad. Carlton doesn't mess around. The name was the key. Carlton. When I played the recording for Ellen later that day, her eyes lit up with a fierce intensity. Carlton Page, she whispered, already typing furiously on her laptop. He's a senior processing officer at the State Pension Bureau. I've been trying to connect him directly to Burns for months, but he's clean. No paper trail. She turned the laptop screen toward me. It showed a photo of a thin, unassuming man with wire-rimmed glasses, perhaps in his mid-50s. He looked like the kind of man you'd never notice in a crowd. If we can find a single financial transaction between Page and Burns, just one, the whole corrupt network collapses. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think, to search my memory for any detail that might help. Walter's office, I said suddenly. He keeps client files going back decades. When Catherine died, I had to sign estate paperwork there. I remember he pulled some old files from a safe in his office. Ellen leaned forward, her attention absolute. Do you remember where the safe was? I pictured the room clearly. The heavy oak desk, the leather-bound books, the faint smell of polish. It was behind his desk, built directly into the wall, hidden behind a framed print of a sailboat. He used a combination lock. A heavy silence fell between us. Arthur, she said slowly, I can't ask you to do this. But I was already thinking it through. After I retired from the railroad, I cleaned offices part-time for a few years to keep busy. That building was on my route. I still have the master key. I waited until midnight on a Tuesday, knowing the cleaning crews would be long gone. Walter's law office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown. It was an old building with an old security system. No cameras, just a basic alarm that I knew was disengaged by the building's master key. My hands, slick with sweat, shook as I inserted the key into the back entrance lock. The office was dark and profoundly silent, the air thick with the smell of old paper and lemon polish. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate the familiar layout, the narrow beam dancing across filing cabinets and empty desks until I reached Walter's private office. The safe was exactly where I remembered it, concealed behind the painting. The dial on the combination lock had 4 numbers. My mind raced. I tried Catherine's birthday. Nothing. I tried my own birthday. Still nothing. Then, a sudden flash of memory. Walter's wife, Eleanor, had died from the same cancer as Catherine in the same year. I carefully dialed her birthday, a date I remembered from the obituary, 0-8-1-7. With a soft, metallic thud, the safe clicked open. Inside were neat stacks of folders, bundles of cash, and a small, black USB drive labeled with a single, neatly printed letter, C. I pocketed the drive and gently closed the safe. As I turned to leave, the room was suddenly flooded with strobing red and blue lights. They painted the walls through the window blinds. Someone had triggered a silent alarm. The police officer's flashlight beam hit me square in the face, blinding me. Sir, put your hands where I can see them. The voice was sharp, commanding. I raised them slowly, the small USB drive feeling like it was burning a hole in my pocket. I'm Arthur Bennett, I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. This is my lawyer's office. I just needed to retrieve some personal files. They didn't believe me. I was taken to the downtown station and placed in a small, sterile room with fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered, hurting my eyes. I explained everything to the detective who came to interview me, a stern-faced woman named Crawford. I told her about my pension, about Dean, about Walter Burns and the forgery. My voice shook with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. Mr. Bennett, you do understand that breaking and entering is a serious crime, she said when I had finished. I know, I replied, but my lawyer helped steal my life savings. I believe that USB drive in my pocket has the proof. Detective Crawford studied me for a long, silent moment. You're asking me to believe that your own lawyer, a respected member of the bar, conspired with your son to defraud you. Yes, I said simply. She sighed and left the room. 40 agonizing minutes later, she returned carrying a laptop. We accessed the drive, she said, her tone all business. You were right, but it's much bigger than you thought. She turned the screen toward me. It was a spreadsheet, a list of 23 names, 23 stolen pensions. My heart stopped. The state investigation, now armed with the irrefutable evidence from the USB drive, moved with a speed that was almost dizzying. Walter Burns's office was raided at dawn the very next morning. That afternoon, Ellen's explosive article went live on her news syndicate's website. Pension fraud network exposed after elderly victim fights back. My phone began ringing and didn't stop. Television stations, national newspapers, and even former clients of Walter Burns who, after reading the story, were suddenly wondering about their own mysteriously dwindling funds. I sat in my living room, a spectator to the demolition of the lives that had tried to demolish mine. The evening news showed footage of Walter being led from his office in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief. The news anchor called him the alleged mastermind of a multi-million-dollar pension theft operation that had targeted vulnerable and elderly citizens across the state. I should have felt a surge of triumph, a sense of victory. Instead, I just felt hollow. Ellen came over and sat beside me on the couch, a silent, supportive presence. "You did the right thing, Arthur," she said quietly. I could only nod, my eyes fixed on the television screen. Dean's name hadn't been mentioned in any of the reports yet. The investigators were protecting their smaller players, using them to build an airtight case against the ringleaders, Walter and Carlton. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Dean's turn was coming. The inevitable call came at 6 in the morning, 2 weeks after Walter's arrest. The phone's ring shattered the pre-dawn quiet. "Dad, please." It was Dean, his voice raw and desperate, stripped of all the cold confidence he'd displayed in the park. "They're coming for me next. The prosecutor called my lawyer this morning. They have everything. The wire transfers from my account, the recordings of our conversation. Everything." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. For a fleeting, painful moment, I didn't hear the man who had betrayed me. I heard the little boy who used to call me Daddy, the child who would cry whenever I had to leave for long work trips on the railroad. Then the memory was brutally pushed aside by another. The image of my forged signature, the sight of Catherine's stolen watch on his mantle, the sting of his condescending word, confused. "Dean," I asked, my own voice sounding strangely calm, "why did you do it?" A long silence stretched over the line, filled only by the sound of his ragged breathing. Then, so quietly I could barely hear him, he said, "I was drowning, Dad. Credit card debt. The mortgage was underwater. Natalie wanted things I couldn't afford to give her. Walter said it was simple. He said it was just like borrowing against your future inheritance. He swore you'd never even notice." "I noticed," I said softly, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am so sorry. You should have thought about that before you called me confused," I said, and I hung up the phone. An hour later, my phone rang again. It was Ellen. "Arthur, I just got a tip from my source inside the prosecutor's office," she said, her voice urgent. "Dean's at the Riverside Motel out on Route 8. He's checked out of his house. My source says he's planning to run." I got dressed without thinking, my movements automatic, and drove to meet her. We pulled into the motel's dilapidated parking lot just as the sun was breaking through the clouds. We arrived before the police. Dean's silver BMW was parked haphazardly outside room 14. Through the grimy window, we could see him. A suitcase was open on the bed, and he was frantically counting stacks of cash, spreading the bills across the faded bedspread. When he looked up and saw me standing in the parking lot, he froze, his face a mask of shock and fury. We just stared at each other through the glass for a long moment. He came outside slowly, his hands shaking with rage. "You think this makes us even?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Turning me in? Destroying your own son for money?" I slowly shook my head. "This isn't about revenge, Dean. This was never about revenge. It's about consequences." His angry facade crumpled, replaced by a look of pure despair. "Dad, I'm your son," he pleaded. "I know," I said quietly, the words aching in my throat. "And that's what makes this hurt so much." In the distance, the first faint wail of sirens began to grow louder. Dean's eyes went wide with panic. I turned and walked back to Ellen's car, getting in without looking back. I didn't watch them put him in handcuffs. The courtroom was smaller and stuffier than I had expected. Dean, looking pale and diminished, pled guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud. He accepted a deal from the prosecution, a reduced sentence in exchange for his full testimony against Walter Burns. He was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security facility. Walter Burns, on the other hand, fought every charge with the full force of his legal cunning. His high-priced lawyer argued that the USB drive was inadmissible, fruit of an illegal search. He claimed I was a disgruntled father who had planted the evidence, and he accused the police of improper search and seizure procedures. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman, remained calm and methodical throughout the defense's theatrics. Finally, during her closing arguments, she produced an audio recorder. "Your Honor, the state calls its final witness." She played a recording. It was Walter's own voice, secretly captured by his paralegal, a young man who had grown suspicious months ago and had gone to the authorities. Page will process it cleanly through the system. Walter's voice arrogantly boomed through the silent courtroom. The old man, Bennett, he'll never know what hit him. The courtroom went utterly still. The color drained from Walter's face, leaving it a pasty shade of gray. The judge denied his request for bail pending sentencing. I sat in the back row, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I didn't look at Walter. I didn't need to. True justice, I was learning, didn't require eye contact. The call from the state pension office came on a Tuesday morning, nearly 3 months after the trial had concluded. Mr. Bennett, a cheerful administrative voice said, "We're pleased to inform you that your funds have been fully restored. The amount recovered from Mr. Burns's frozen assets was sufficient to cover all victims, including interest calculated at the federal rate. The total amount deposited into your account this morning is $312,000. I had to sit down on the edge of my bed. The representative continued talking, mentioning additional compensation from a victim's fund for emotional distress, but her voice faded into a dull buzz. $312,000. It was more than I had lost. I hung up the phone and opened my online banking portal on my laptop. The numbers shimmered on the screen, seeming unreal, as if they might vanish if I looked away for even a second. My first thought was to call Dean, to tell him. I reached for the phone, then stopped myself. What would I even say? The money, the tangible object of our conflict, was back. But it couldn't fix what was truly broken between us. It couldn't bring back the father-son fishing trips, the shared laughter over holiday meals, or the fundamental trust we had built over 30 years of life. Some things, I realized with a profound sadness, stayed broken no matter how much money you had in the bank. Ellen's feature article on the case went national the following week. Retired conductor uncovers multi-million-dollar fraud ring after son's betrayal was the headline that appeared in newspapers from California to New York. My quiet life was over. Strangers would recognize me at the grocery store, patting me on the back and calling me brave. Some even asked for photos. I didn't feel brave. I felt tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. But despite the unwanted attention, something inside me had fundamentally changed. I stopped double-locking my bedroom door at night. I stopped glancing over my shoulder in parking lots. The constant, low-grade fear that had taken up residence in my chest since that first day at the bank finally began to loosen its suffocating grip. People called me a hero, but I knew the truth. I wasn't fighting for some grand notion of justice or seeking vengeance. I was just an old man trying to survive. Sometimes, that has to be enough. Ellen still visited every few weeks, keeping me updated. Because of my case, other victims had found the courage to come forward. The state legislature was debating sweeping pension reform bills. It seemed that from all this pain, from this terrible betrayal, some good might actually grow. The thought was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. The letter arrived on a Saturday morning, the envelope bearing the stamped return address of the county prison. I recognized Dean's handwriting immediately. My own hands shook as I carefully slid it open. "Dad," it began, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I think about you every single day. I think about the things you taught me when I was a kid that I forgot somewhere along the way. Things like honesty, integrity, the value of hard work. I threw all of that away for money I didn't even get to keep. Mom's watch is in a box in the attic at the house. Natalie will give it to you if you ask for it. I miss it. I miss her. Most of all, I miss the person I used to be before I became someone you couldn't trust." I read the letter 3 times, my vision blurring as hot tears dripped onto the cheap prison stationery. The anger I had carried for so many months suddenly felt different, heavier, like a suit of armor I no longer had the strength or the desire to wear. I folded the letter carefully, its creases now soft with my tears, and placed it in my top desk drawer, next to the handkerchief Catherine had embroidered for me so long ago. I didn't throw it away. I didn't answer it, either. But deep inside me, something shifted, like a rusted lock finally giving way, opening a door just a crack. I visited Dean 3 weeks later. The prison was an hour's drive north of the city, a grim, gray building surrounded by towering fences topped with coiled razor wire. Inside, I was guided through a series of metal detectors and heavy, buzzing doors into a stark visiting room filled with cheap plastic chairs and humming vending machines. When Dean walked in, he looked smaller, thinner. The orange jumpsuit seemed to swallow him, his arrogant confidence stripped away by institutional routine and, I hoped, by remorse. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking on the single word. "I didn't think you'd come." We sat across from each other at a small, bolted-down table. The chasm between us felt a mile wide. I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt too small a phrase for the wreckage he had caused. "I'm angry" felt too heavy a burden to keep carrying. "I got your letter," I finally managed to say. He nodded, fresh tears running unchecked down his face. "I meant every word of it." We sat in a difficult silence for a long time, the loud ticking of the clock on the wall marking the slow passage of our allotted hour. Just before I had to leave, I reached across the table and squeezed his hand once. He gripped it like a drowning man holding a lifeline. I didn't forgive him that day. Maybe I never would completely. But in that moment, I remembered that he was my son long before he was a criminal. And that had to count for something. Before I sold the house and moved into an assisted living facility closer to the city, I wrote one final letter. It wasn't to Dean, but to Ellen. She published it in her follow-up article on pension reform. "Justice," I wrote, "doesn't always come from a place of anger. Sometimes it grows quietly from patience, from the stubborn decision to survive long enough for the truth to speak louder than the lies. I am 74 years old. For a time, I thought I would die feeling betrayed and broken. Instead, I'm here to tell you that honesty still matters, that doing the right thing still counts for something, even when the right thing costs you everything you thought you couldn't lose. To anyone else out there who feels like they are fighting alone, document everything, trust your instincts, and please remember that their power often lies in your silence. Silence sometimes means they've already won." I signed it simply, Arthur Bennett, retired conductor. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I smiled. A real smile. Because I was learning that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. It's simply refusing to let them destroy you first. And despite everything they had taken, I was still standing.